how are pastors, leaders, etc., chosen in Calvary chapels? And if you guys catch on, I'm basically going through the outline that Pastor Chuck went through in his book. So when you look at, and I came out of the Baptist denomination, meaning that's the church that I first got saved, and my first experience in the church was the Baptist. And we have a totally different way of going about this subject. So when you look at Calvary Chapel and how they initiate leadership or find their pastors, what do you say to that point?
Well, part of it is, like I said, we're non-denominational, and so because there's not, there is a Calvary Chapel Bible College, we have a Calvary Bible Institute, we have places where leaders are raised up, but most often when you have a pastor at a church, it's someone who's been raised up in that church or someone who planted that church.
Right.
And so that's kind of unique. Chuck talks in the book about a call to ministry. So that's the idea that it's something that God has called you to. It's not something that you chose. It's not a job that you went out and sought. It's not something you went, well, I'll just go to university or seminary in this case and get my degree, and then I'll go through, the hiring process. I'll get on monster jobs or whatever it is called, and find myself a church that will hire a pastor or a worship pastor, whatever gig you're looking for. It really doesn't work that way. I mean, every once in a while, Calvary's will hire from without, and by without, I mean they're looking at people from that aren't in their church, that weren't raised in their church, and we've done that a couple of times. We've hired guys who didn't necessarily grow up in a church or were raised in ministry in a church, and some of it with mixed bag results. But with all that being said, that's not really the issue. The issue is, how does someone come to ministry? It's like, it's got to be led by the Spirit. It's got to be a call on God, to the point where if you refuse it, you're in disobedience to God. And you have that mentality of, okay, God is, the verse that Chuck puts in the book is in the book from Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is like, the word is like burning in my heart. I can't yet not speak it. It's like, I have to say these things. It's so important that I share this truth. And I think in a lot of ways that's kind of an organic way for Calvary Chapels to choose leadership, is we have people who have a call. They've been called into ministry. And that's also the emphasis when we're talking to people about ministry, is number one, make sure you're called. If you're called into ministry, then God will provide. He'll open doors. He'll make the way clear. He'll make the path clear. But number one, you have to be called. And when you have that calling, and then you just pursue the Lord in faith, and he kind of blesses it, and he kind of works it out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so in the different denomination that I just mentioned, I know that Baptist is a general. I mean, there's a lot of room in that denomination. But the way that I saw that fellowship go about it was totally different. What I mean by that is this. You had the dude go to seminary, get a seminary degree or Bible college or whatever, and then he would come out and apply to be in a church, whether it's worship or pastor or whatever, with his degree and basically his resume. Mm-hmm. And so the church, there's probably, 4 or 5 different senior pastors during the course of the time that I was there, which to me says something. It says a little bit about what's going on. But in any case, they would interview the pastor, right, and then have him come and preach to the church. And some of this is going to cross over when we talk about church government and how that's set up. But you would have the guy basically give a sermon, and then the church, depending on, again, the church government, whether it's elder ran or congregational ran, they would basically vote or decide, was that good? Is he a good fit for this denomination? And so that was how, and it's very similar in my thinking to going and applying for a job. This is my resume. This is how I'm qualified, and I think I'm a good fit here, and this is why I want to come to work for you, and all that stuff. And then I came to Calvary Chapel, and it was totally different, where you had these just dudes from the world. Some of them were a cop for 2 decades, and then all of a sudden now they're a senior pastor, or they were just, discipled out of the church. And they were, I don't want to characterize, but, across the board, I mean, when you look at, I mentioned Raul Reese, just like blue collar, scruffy, dudes that are just, there's no PhD, in Bible college. Yeah. And yet you saw the Spirit of God moving through these guys in such a way that it was absolutely phenomenal because you look at that and there's no way that this guy doesn't know the Lord. Like, something's going on here. And it was so attractive to me to be able to see a normal dude raised up by the Lord and then put into ministry versus a professional coming out with his degree or whatever and trying to apply a job. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. When you go through Scripture, that's how the Lord chooses. When you look at his disciples, it's like tax collectors and some dude that's in a terrorist club and fishermen and stuff. And he brings people out of the world and then calls them into ministry. And I thought I think that approach, being filled with the Spirit, is totally different than maybe some other ways of doing it. And so you talked about also, and I just want to highlight this, being called into ministry specifically. So I want to ask you, how did God call you into ministry? How did you know that you were called to be a pastor? Because I think that'll be neat in how this unpacks in your story.
Actually, yeah, that's not too dissimilar from how I went about being called in ministry. You know, I have this question asked often because I do young adults and they're looking for purpose. They're wondering what their life's going to be like. And, you know, they're asking me, how did you know this is what you're supposed to do? And honestly, when I look back, a lot of it was just nothing else made any sense. I looked at, you know, applying for college, doing certain jobs and doing certain things. And I just came back to, what am I wasting my time on these things? And I just had this burden, like, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. And nothing else made any sense. I mean, it's just real simple. It's not, again, I don't feel like my call is superior to someone else's. It's, you know, I would share that with people. Well, I don't feel that burden. Well, that's not what God's called you to. Or if you're a businessman, God's called you to that, then he's called you to be wise in your business and make money to support ministry. I mean, there's so many different veins of your calling. It doesn't have to be this in this form, in this ministry. But with that being said, for me, it was one of those things where I was like, nothing else makes sense. I don't know why I would do anything else and waste my time. And again, I'm not saying that anyone else's time is wasted by doing what God called them to do. That's just how I felt. So
yeah. So one of the important distinctions that's made here, you know, Steve talks about this quite a bit, is that it's important to know that you're called to ministry because, you know, you've been in ministry how many years?
18 actually.
Yeah. So, you know, ministry gets messy. It gets tough. You have seasons where, you know, like I've had other jobs. I've just been in full-time ministry actually the last 3.5 years. And I've had other jobs in the world where it's like, man, I'm kind of done with this. I'm ready to quit. And if you don't have this process vetted, where you know God's called you into that and that's where you're supposed to be, it's very easy to get taken advantage of by the enemy, by your flesh, to give up and quit and try and take a different route because ministry can get hard. You really have to know that God called you to that and have it cemented, in my opinion, before you go into ministry. And if you do that, it prevents a lot of things that are going to come down the road as far as condemnation and getting, you know what I'm trying to say, getting frustrated.
Yeah, and doubt and, you know, questioning whether or not did God really call me this? Right. And maybe he didn't, and then you abandon the sheep. And that's the last thing God would want for people is, you know, if you're invested in people's lives and you're called to ministry, you're called to be a shepherd. And, you know, there's a responsibility there. And how dare you go into the shepherding of God's flock and go, well, I didn't really know if it's for me. You know, with that mentality, that's not how God's called us. So